An old man ripped up a floorboard in a church and found a ledger book wrapped in cloth. That finding would give a dead man's words the voice they'd been denied for 30 years. But Rufus Odell didn't know any of that yet. He only knew that his knees hurt and that the fourth board from the center aisle felt wrong under his pry bar, and that wrongness was enough to make him stop. It was a Wednesday morning, early enough that the dew still sat heavy on the gravel in the parking lot outside, on the pecan leaves, on the hood of his Chevy pickup where he'd left it under the nearest tree. Rufus had been at the church since 7. He'd parked, walked around to the bed of the truck, and pulled out his canvas tool roll, his pry bar, his knee pads, and the box of 16-penny nails he'd bought at the hardware store in Camden the day before. He set them on the front steps while he unlocked the door. He had the deacon's key on a ring with his own house key and his barn key and a small flat key that no longer opened anything he could remember. He'd meant to take it off the ring for 2 years running. The sanctuary smelled the way it always did: old hymnals, furniture polish, the faint trace of candle wax that never quite burned off even in summer. The ceiling fans were off. The windows let in long panels of yellow morning light, and dust moved through them slowly, unhurried, the way dust does in a place that has no reason to rush. Rufus dropped to one knee at the back of the center aisle and pressed his palm flat against the nearest board. Solid. He walked it forward, board by board, pressing every 2 feet until he reached the 4th row of pews. There. The wood under his hand had a softness to it, a slight give that didn't belong. He pressed again. The board flexed the way a board does when the joist beneath it has gone punky with rot. He'd volunteered for this job because Deacon Ray Tilden had made a general announcement after service 3 weeks back, saying the floor near the center aisle had gotten spongy in spots and probably needed attention before the Christmas program started in December and somebody's grandmother went through it. Nobody raised a hand. Rufus waited a moment, looking at the ceiling, then raised his. He did things like that. It wasn't a virtue he thought about. He just had a set of skills and a certain understanding that skills unused are wasted wood. He was 63 and had been a carpenter since he was 16, when his uncle Wayman took him on as a helper the summer after Rufus's father decided he preferred Natchez to Alabama and made himself scarce. Wayman was a lean man with 2 missing fingers on his left hand and a habit of testing new lumber by bending it across his knee with the bad hand. He said if it didn't crack, it was good wood. He said the same about people. Rufus had been working with wood for 47 years and had retired from the shop he ran out of his barn 3 years ago when his right knee started giving him the kind of grief that made ladders a bad idea. He still took small jobs. Church floors were small jobs. His wife Louise had packed him a thermos that morning without asking if he wanted one. She set it by his work boots the night before, the way she did when she knew he'd be out early. He'd poured himself a cup in the truck before he got out, holding it in both hands while the engine ticked and cooled. The coffee was strong the way he liked it, with a little chicory she'd started adding the year before. He never asked her to. She just did. The sanctuary was quiet except for the sound of his pry bar working the first board free, then the second. He set each pulled board against the nearest pew. The first 2 were soft but not rotten, replaceable, with good reason. The third board had already been repaired at some point, the nails different gauge, the wood a slightly lighter color where someone had patched it maybe 15 or 20 years back. Rufus noted that and moved on. The fourth board. He worked the pry bar under its near end and levered slowly, feeling the nails give one by one, the wood sighing as it came free. He lifted it and set it aside. Beneath it, resting in the dark gap between the joists on a bed of packed red clay, was a bundle wrapped in dark oilcloth, tied with lengths of brown twine that had gone stiff with age. It sat there the way things sit when they have been waiting a long time. Rufus set down his pry bar. He stayed on one knee for a moment, looking at it without touching it. The oilcloth was dark and mottled, but unbroken. Whoever had wrapped it had done the job carefully, folded the edges under, and tied the twine in 2 directions, the way you'd wrap something you meant to keep dry. He reached in and lifted the bundle. It was heavier than he expected. He brought it up into the light. He set it on the nearest pew and untied the twine. The knots were tight with age, but not impossible. He worked them loose with his fingers and folded back the oilcloth in sections, each layer coming open to reveal the next. Inside was a ledger book. Its cover was water-stained in one corner, but otherwise intact. A proper accounting ledger, the kind a general store or a county clerk's office might have kept 40 years ago, with a dark cloth spine and ruled pages. The binding was tight, the pages still white in the middle, though they'd browned at the edges. Rufus opened it. The first page was dated 1992, written in a neat, practiced hand. 2 columns ran down every page, received on the left, deposited on the right. He looked at the first entry. Received, $420. Deposited, $290. A difference of $130 on a single Sunday in January of that year. He turned the page. The same 2 columns. The same pattern. Received always larger. Deposited always less. He turned pages slowly. The sanctuary quiet around him, the dust still moving in the light. The entries continued year by year, the handwriting steady, methodical, regular as a heartbeat. He turned to the back of the ledger. Tucked between the last pages were bank deposit slips, each one made out in the name of Hollis Mabry. A separate bank, in Selma, not Camden. He counted the slips. 11 of them, spanning different years, each one representing a transfer to an account with a different number than the church's. Behind the slips, a single sheet of paper in a different hand, shakier, the letters large and deliberate, like a man writing something important and wanting it legible. It read, "I know what you are doing, Hollis." Rufus set the sheet down on the pew beside the ledger. He recognized that handwriting. He had seen it on a Christmas card years ago, the last one the man ever sent. It belonged to Elmer Gadsden, Pearl's husband, who had been dead for 11 years and whose grave Rufus had helped carry to on a cold morning in January 2015. He read the numbers 3 times before he believed them. He sat down on the pew beside the ledger and looked at the light coming through the tall windows and did not say anything, because there was no one there to say anything to. Rufus repaired the 4th board from the outside in, cut a new piece of pine, fitted it to the joists, nailed it down with 8-penny nails the way it should have been done originally. He finished the rest of the aisle that afternoon, pulling 3 more soft boards, replacing 2 of them entirely, renailing the 3rd. He worked until the light through the window started going amber and he couldn't see the grain well enough to trust his cuts. Then he swept the sawdust into a pile, loaded his tools into the truck, and laid the ledger in its oilcloth bundle in the bed beside his canvas roll, under an old feed sack to keep it out of sight. He drove home on the county road, passing the kudzu line where old Bud Crenshaw's fence posts had disappeared sometime in August. Swallowed to the crossbar by the vines that crept out of the ditch every summer and kept coming until the first hard frost killed them back. He'd told Bud twice about it. Bud said kudzu was the good Lord's way of recycling bad farm decisions, and he didn't argue with the good Lord. Louise was on the porch when he pulled up, sitting in the ladder-back chair she kept out there from April to November. She had a library book open in her lap, but she wasn't reading it. She was watching the heat lightning over the tree line to the south, the way she did when a storm might be coming. She had a cup of something on the rail beside her. "You look pale," she said. "I'm all right." She watched him get out of the truck and reach into the bed for his tool roll without taking the feed sack with it. "You eat lunch?" "I had my thermos." "That's coffee, not lunch." She went inside without further discussion of the matter, and 10 minutes later she called him in to where she'd set a plate of leftover chicken and cornbread on the table. He ate without tasting it. After dinner, he waited until Louise settled in front of the television in the back room, then spread the ledger open on the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad beside it and a carpenter's pencil. He started at 1992. He wrote down each year's discrepancy in a column on the pad, the gap between what had been received and what had been deposited. Some entries were small, $100, $150. But by the mid-90s, the gaps were running to $300 and $400 a week. And after the turn of the millennium, when the congregation had grown and the building fund donations had picked up because Pastor Worthy started the New Wing campaign, the annual skim cleared $6,000, then $7,000, then $8,000. He did the arithmetic carefully, adding each year's total, checking it twice. He was not a man who trusted a number the first time it appeared. When he totaled the column, the figure was $183,420. 30 years. He set his pencil down and looked at the number for a while. He thought about what $183,000 meant to a congregation where most of the families had been farming or working county government jobs for 3 generations, and where a $500 roof repair got discussed at 3 deacons' meetings before anyone approved it. He thought about the new wing, the fellowship hall, and the youth room, and the covered walkway that appeared in a drawing framed on the wall outside the pastor's study and had appeared there for as long as Rufus could remember. He remembered asking Hollis about it once, maybe 10 years back, and Hollis had shaken his head and said the funds just weren't there. He'd said it with the easy regret of a man explaining a thing he had no power over. Rufus picked up the bank deposit slips and laid them in a row on the table. They were from a First Southern branch in Selma, 30 miles west of Camden. 11 slips, same account number on all 11. Not the church's account. A personal account in the name of H.T. Mabry. He leaned back in his chair. He could hear the television through the wall, a game show, the kind Louise watched without caring who won. He thought about Hollis Mabry, 78 years old, deacon for 45 years, the man who organized the church picnic every Independence Day and wore the same dark suit jacket every Sunday, who folded his hands over his stomach when he prayed in a way that somehow communicated genuine humility. He was the most trusted man Rufus had ever been suspicious of, which had previously seemed like a failing in himself. He wasn't treating it as a failing now. He picked up Elmer's note. "I know what you are doing, Hollis." He thought about Elmer, who had served as church treasurer from 85 to 91. Elmer, who stepped down suddenly that fall, which everyone had attributed to the blood pressure trouble his doctor had been warning him about since 88. His wife Pearl had said very little about it at the time. Come to think on it, Pearl hadn't said much about Elmer's resignation at all, not then and not in the years since. And Pearl Gadsden was not a woman who left important things unsaid out of forgetfulness. The ledger started in 92, the year after Elmer left the treasurer's position. Rufus turned that over slowly. Elmer discovers the theft. Elmer leaves the treasurer's job. Someone, Elmer himself, the handwriting said, documents the scheme and hides the evidence under the floor of the church. Not in his house, where it could be found or destroyed. Under the floor of the building the money was being stolen from. A ledger book sealed in oilcloth on a bed of red Alabama clay, waiting for the right pry bar. Had Elmer intended to come back for it? Had he been waiting for the right moment? Or had the stroke taken him before he could act? He died 11 years ago. The ledger had been under that floor for over 30 years. Louise came to the kitchen doorway in her house slippers, holding her empty cup. She looked at the table, the ledger, the legal pad, the deposit slips in their row. She looked at his face. She did not ask. "I'll explain tomorrow," he said. She nodded once and went to rinse her cup at the sink. "Lock the door before you come to bed," she said, and went back to the hall. He heard her door click shut. Rufus sat alone at the kitchen table with 30 years of theft laid out in 2 columns on ruled paper, and listened to the house settle and thought about a dead man who had known the truth and died without telling it. He picked up the deposit slip from the year 2007. H.T. Mabry, $840 in a single transfer. That October, Rufus remembered, the church had canceled the heating system repair because the fund was short. People had sat in their coats through 3 Sundays of December service. He put the slips back between the ledger pages. He set the oilcloth over it and folded it closed. He tied the twine back the way he'd found it, 2 directions, the edges tucked under. Then he carried the bundle to his closet and set it in the lockbox where he kept his important papers. The land deed, Louise's mother's jewelry. He snapped the padlock shut. He came back to the kitchen, washed his hands, and looked out the window at the dark yard. The heat lightning was gone. The sky had gone thick and close, the stars swallowed. He wouldn't sleep much, he already knew that. Saturday morning, Rufus drove his Chevy pickup south along the county road with the windows down, watching the tree line for the turn onto the dirt lane that went back to Pearl Gadsden's place. He'd been there before, twice for funerals. Once when Elmer asked him to fix a section of back porch that had gone rotten, 8 or 9 years before Elmer died. He remembered that porch. He'd replaced 6 boards and 2 joists, and Elmer had stood watching the whole time, not in an impatient way, but in the way of a man who was interested in how things got done and had nowhere particular to be. They'd talked about the church that day, about the building fund and whether the new wing would ever get off the ground. Elmer had gone quiet when Rufus mentioned Hollis's name. Just quiet for a moment, and then he'd changed the subject to the weather. Pearl's house sat back from the lane behind a stand of azalea bushes that her husband had planted in the 60s, red ones and white ones that bloomed fierce in early spring and spent the rest of the year as a respectable green hedge. The house was white clapboard, the same as the church, with a screen porch across the front that Pearl used for everything from shelling peas to reading her mail. She was out there when Rufus pulled in a wooden rocker with a glass of sweet tea on the rail beside her. She had a face that made you pay attention, not because it was particularly striking, but because it missed nothing. She wore her hair pinned up and her church dress on a Saturday, which was just how Pearl Gadsden did things. And she watched him come up the porch steps with an expression that was neither welcoming nor unwelcoming, just alert. She had a piece of embroidery in her lap that she set aside when he sat down in the other chair. Her glasses were thick-lensed and slightly crooked. One arm had been repaired with a length of electrical tape wrapped around the hinge, neat and secure, the kind of repair that said she'd noticed the problem and dealt with it without making a fuss. "I'll get you some tea," she said. "Don't trouble yourself, Pearl. I won't be long." "I'll get you some tea," she said again, and went inside. She came back with a glass so cold the sides wept in the August heat. Rufus drank half of it in one pull. She settled back in her rocker. "I found something under the church floor," he said. She looked at him. "I was pulling up the soft boards in the center aisle. Under the 4th one, there was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth." She picked up her embroidery and set it down again. A long pause. A mockingbird in the azaleas ran through 4 different songs in a row. "What kind of bundle?" she said. "A ledger book and some bank deposit slips." He paused. "And a note." Pearl's hands were still in her lap. She said nothing. "The note was in Elmer's hand, Pearl. I recognized it." She turned her head and looked toward the far end of the porch, toward the lane, toward nothing in particular. Her jaw moved once, like she was deciding something. When she turned back, her eyes were clear and not particularly wet. She had known something for 30 years, and some part of her had been waiting for this conversation. "Tell me about Elmer," he said. "Why he stopped being treasurer." She breathed in slowly and out again. "Elmer came home one night in March of '91. Sat right here, this chair. He didn't eat his supper. He just sat. I let him sit." She paused. "After dark, he told me he'd found something wrong with the books. Said the received column never matched the deposited column, and it wasn't a mistake. Said Hollis was taking money." "What did he plan to do?" "He said he was going to write it all down, every entry, every year he could find, every penny. Then he was going to take it to the pastor." She picked up her tea and held it without drinking. "He was careful about things, Elmer. He wouldn't go with one number. He wanted the whole picture." "Did he go to the pastor?" "No." She set her glass down on the rail with a small, precise sound. 2 weeks after that, Hollis came to the house. I wasn't in the room, I was in the kitchen, but I could hear the tone of it. Not the words, just the tone. Hollis was quiet and easy, the way he always was. Elmer was quieter. She paused. After Hollis left, Elmer came to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water and drank it standing at the sink. He didn't say anything for a long while. Then he said he was going to step down from the treasurer's position. "Did you ask him why?" "I asked him once." Her face didn't change, but something moved behind it. "He said it wasn't worth it. Said some things were bigger than one person's sense of justice. I didn't believe him, but I let him be." Her voice was even. "He resigned the next Sunday. He never talked about it again." "His stroke," Rufus said carefully. 6 months after that." She looked at him directly. "The doctor said stress. Elmer was a healthy man until he wasn't. He spent 6 months not sleeping." She let the rest of that sit where it was. They were quiet for a while. The mockingbird moved on to a different tree. "You found Elmer's book," Pearl said. It was not a question. Rufus nodded. She closed her eyes for a moment, her hands folded in her lap. When she opened them, they were clear and hard, the eyes of a woman who had measured this moment from far away and arrived at it exactly as she'd expected. "Then you finish what he started," she said. Rufus stood. He thanked her for the tea. She nodded once and picked up her embroidery. He drove home on the county road with Pearl's words riding along in the cab beside him, quiet and specific, the way instructions you already half knew tend to sound when someone finally says them out loud. He pulled onto his property, and his stomach went tight before he'd even registered what he was seeing. Hollis Mabry's dark Ford sedan was parked in his driveway, pulled up neatly beside the fence. Hollis stood by the front porch steps, leaning on the black metal cane he'd started using last spring, his hat held in both hands in front of him. He was dressed in his dark jacket and good trousers on a Saturday morning. He smiled when Rufus got out of the truck, a pleasant, open smile, the kind a man produces without effort when he's had decades of practice. "Afternoon, Rufus. Thought I'd stop by." He looked at the truck, at Rufus's hands, at the tool roll in the truck bed. "Heard you're doing fine work on those floors. The board work always matters more than people think." He paused, his hands shifting on the brim of his hat. "Find anything interesting down there?" The question hung in the thick August air between them, like something that had been placed there deliberately. Rufus looked at Hollis for 2 seconds, maybe 3, long enough to see the smile hold steady in Hollis's face while something behind the eyes worked at a different calculation entirely. "Rotten boards," Rufus said. "A couple joists I'll need to sister before I close it up. Nothing else." Hollis nodded slowly, working the brim of his hat with his thumbs. "Moisture gets up through the foundation something fierce in August. Always has." He looked at the porch, at the pecan tree, at the truck bed again. "Well, I won't keep you." He put his hat back on, settled it, and turned to his car. Rufus watched him go. The Ford moved out of the driveway at a careful speed, turned onto the county road, and Rufus saw the way Hollis's hands gripped the wheel as the car straightened, both hands high on the rim, knuckles pale against the dark leather. It was not the grip of a man out for a pleasant Saturday drive. He went inside. Louise was at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on, going through a stack of church bulletins she was sorting for the historical committee. She did that every few months. The committee had been meaning to put together a proper archive for years, and Louise was the only one who actually made progress on it. She looked up when he came in. "Hollis was here," she said. "I saw. He came about 20 minutes ago, asked if you'd be home soon. I said you'd probably be back from wherever you'd gone by afternoon." She watched him go to the sink and wash his hands. He seemed pleasant. He always seems pleasant. She took her glasses off and held them. "Rufus." "I'll explain tonight," he said, "after supper." He spent the afternoon in the barn, going through lumber stock for the next phase of the floor work. He measured the boards he'd need, stacked them in the order he'd use them, made marks with a carpenter's pencil on each one. His hands worked without his full attention, while his mind worked the problem. He had the ledger, he had the deposit slips, he had Elmer's note. He had Pearl's account of events, not evidence exactly, but a human frame for what the paper already said. What he did not have was a clear path through the middle of it. He could go to the sheriff, but that meant a formal process that would be public and slow and would hit the congregation like a storm before anyone had a chance to prepare. He could go directly to the bishop, but the bishop was 3 levels of church hierarchy above Pastor Worthy, and the whole weight of it would bypass the community that had been living with the wound without knowing it. The most direct path led through Pastor Worthy's study. He drove to the church Monday morning before the pastor arrived and waited in his truck under the pecan trees, drinking the coffee he'd brought. The parking lot was empty. The building sat in the morning shade, white and quiet, the same building it had always been, looking no different than it had last Wednesday when he'd knelt on the aisle floor thinking about rotten joists. A building doesn't change when what's been hidden inside it comes to light. Only the people who know about it change. Pastor James Worthy arrived at 8:10 in his old GMC pickup, a blue one he'd been driving for 12 years and that had a cracked taillight he'd never gotten around to replacing. He was a man in his late 50s with a long face and careful eyes and a way of moving that suggested he'd made his peace with taking things one at a time. He saw Rufus's truck and paused at his own door before coming over. "Rufus, everything all right? Need to talk to you, Pastor. Inside, if you don't mind." The pastor's study was a small room behind the sanctuary, lined with bookshelves and smelling of old hymnals and lemon oil. A print of the 23rd Psalm hung above the desk, framed in dark wood, and below it a photograph of the congregation from the church's centennial year, everyone standing in rows in the parking lot, blinking into the sun. Rufus could pick out faces in it: Pearl Gadsden, 3 rows back on the left, Hollis Mabry standing at the far right end of the front row in his dark jacket, hands folded at his waist, looking directly at the camera with that same steady, certain expression. Rufus set the ledger on the pastor's desk. He set the bank slips beside it. He set Elmer's note on top. Pastor Worthy read in silence. He sat very still as he read, turning pages with one hand while the other lay flat on the desk. His face moved through the stages Rufus had expected. Confusion first, then the arithmetic of it reaching him, then something slower and heavier than comprehension, something that had grief in it. He read Elmer's note last. He set it down and folded his hands on top of the ledger. "How long have you had this?" "Since last Wednesday." The pastor looked at the ceiling and then back at the desk. "Rufus, if this comes forward the way it's pointing, publicly, it will crack this congregation in half. Hollis has been here 45 years. His daughter is in the choir. His granddaughter was baptized in this church 3 months ago. People here trust him the way they trust the building." He paused. "The way they trusted the building. I know that. Half of them will leave. Families who've been here 3 generations. Older folks who can't take this kind of—" He stopped. "The church might not survive it, Rufus. I'm not being dramatic." "I know that too." Worthy looked at the ledger. He picked up Elmer's note and set it down again. "I want to propose something. We go to Hollis privately. The 3 of us, you, me, and him. We show him this. We demand he step down from all financial responsibilities and from the deaconship. We ask him to return what he can. No police, no formal charges. We absorb the loss and we move forward." He spread his hands on the desk. "The congregation has been living without that money for 30 years. They can continue to live without a confrontation they didn't ask for." Rufus sat with that for a moment. Part of him, the part that had laid floors in people's houses and fixed things quietly and preferred to drive home on the back road, wanted to say yes. It was a reasonable offer. It would avoid a great deal of pain. He thought about Elmer Gadsden, who had tried something like the quiet approach, who had sat across from Hollis and come away from it silenced, who had then spent 6 months unable to sleep and died with an unfinished accusation under a church floor. He thought about Pearl saying, "Finish what he started." He picked up the ledger from the desk. "Pastor," he said, "a quiet deal is what Hollis has been counting on for 30 years." He walked out of the study carrying the ledger, and the door fell shut behind him with a sound like the end of a different kind of conversation. 3 days passed. Rufus went back to the church on Tuesday and worked the remaining floor sections, pulling 2 more boards that had gone soft, planing the replacements, fitting them to the joists. The work was good, and the new wood smelled clean against the old. He liked the way the boards sat when they were properly cut and fitted, the grain meeting, the levels true, the surface tight. He'd always liked that. When you did it right, you could walk the floor afterward and not feel the seam. He did not sleep well. He kept the ledger in the lockbox in the closet and thought about it late at night, the way you think about a piece of work you've started and can't put down. He turned the problem over from different angles. He was not a man who stayed up late thinking, as a rule. He was a man who worked until he was tired and then slept until it was time to work again. Louise noticed the difference. She didn't say anything about it. She started leaving his reading lamp on when she went to bed, which was how she acknowledged things without making them into discussions. On Thursday evening, he drove his Chevy past the church on his way back from the hardware store. The parking lot was empty, but the lights were on inside, the soft glow through the tall windows that meant someone had turned on the sanctuary lights and not the overheads. Rufus slowed and pulled off the road opposite the stand of pecan trees, cut his headlights. Through the front window he could see the shape of a man in the front pew, sitting still, head bowed, not moving. Rufus sat and watched for 20 minutes. The figure didn't move. Hollis, in his Sunday suit on a Thursday night, sitting in the front pew of the church he had stolen from for 30 years. Rufus couldn't tell from the road whether it was prayer or strategy. It didn't matter which it was. A man who prays after 30 years of theft without making any public accounting of the theft is praying for himself, not for the people he stole from. That wasn't judgment speaking. That was arithmetic. He drove home. Friday morning, Pearl called. He answered on the second ring. Her voice was level, but the levelness was the kind you maintain by effort, not the kind that comes naturally. "Hollis came to see me last night," she said. Rufus waited. "First time in years he's come to this house." He sat in Elmer's chair, asked me how I was getting on, asked about my granddaughter in Montgomery. She paused. Then he asked me if I still had any of Elmer's old papers. Work papers, he said. Church committee files, anything like that. He said he was trying to pull together some of the historical records and thought Elmer might have kept copies. "What did you tell him?" "Told him no. Said I'd cleared Elmer's files years ago." Her voice thinned slightly. He didn't believe me. I could see it. He looked at the bookshelf while we were talking, then at the closet door. When he left, he walked around the side of the house instead of back to his car directly. I watched from the window. He looked in through the back porch screen. Cold anger settled in Rufus's chest, not hot, not righteous, just cold and certain. Hollis wasn't sitting in that pew doing penance. He was hunting loose threads. He was trying to find what Elmer might have left behind before anyone else did, before Rufus, or Pearl, or whoever else might know something, could put it in front of a person who would act on it. "He's not going to let this alone, Pearl." "No," she said, "he isn't. I'm going to take care of it, but I need a few days." "I have nothing here for him to find," she said. "You have what he's looking for." "I know. Keep your doors locked." He heard her breathe once. "I've been locking my doors for 30 years, Rufus," she said, and hung up. He drove to Camden at 10 o'clock, to the public library on Claiborne Street, a low brick building with a parking lot in the back and an old Xerox machine near the reference desk that cost a dime a copy. He brought the ledger in a paper grocery bag and fed coins into the machine for over an hour, copying every page front and back, the deposit slips, Elmer's note. He used $3.40 in dimes and came out with a stack of copies he folded into a manila envelope he'd brought from home. The librarian at the reference desk was a woman named Mrs. Portis, who had worked there for as long as Rufus could remember. She had a single long braid of gray hair over one shoulder and a habit of looking at you over her reading glasses instead of through them. She glanced at the grocery bag and the envelope and didn't ask. "Hot out," she said. "Getting worse," he said. Always does in August. She went back to her catalog work. He drove to the post office. He addressed the envelope to Pearl's granddaughter Denise in Montgomery. He knew Denise slightly, knew she was a practical young woman who taught school and had her grandmother's quality of paying attention, and included a handwritten letter that explained what was in the envelope, where it had come from, and what it proved. He asked her to keep it secure and not to act on it until she heard from Pearl or from him directly. He sealed the envelope and mailed it through the window, watching the clerk's hand take it and turn away with it. He drove home. He went to the kitchen. He called Hollis's number. Hollis answered on the third ring, his voice carrying its usual easy quality, unhurried and warm. Hollis Mabry. Hollis, it's Rufus Odell. Rufus. A pause. Good to hear from you. I'd like to meet with you. At the church. Saturday morning, just the two of us. I have something to show you. A silence that was different from a natural pause. Not long, 3 or 4 seconds, but waited. Rufus listened to it. All right, Hollis said. His voice had not changed, but something in the word was different from anything it had been before. He said it the way a man says, all right, when he's been expecting a knock on the door and the knock has finally come. Saturday morning. I'll be there. Rufus hung up the phone. He spent Friday night at his kitchen table with the ledger spread open in front of him. He ran his thumb along the edge of Elmer's note. The paper was fragile, the ink faded at the edges, but dark in the middle, where Elmer's pen had pressed. I know what you are doing, Hollis. Written by a man who then spent 6 months in silence and died with those words hidden under a floor. Every word exactly right and exactly too late. Rufus thought about Hollis tithing. He'd heard, years back from another deacon, that Hollis gave generously to the building fund, that his personal donations were among the largest in the congregation. A tithe on the theft, 10% returned. Not generosity, calculation. Enough charity to stay comfortable in his own skin, not enough to matter to anyone who needed it. He closed the ledger. He put it back in the lockbox. He went to bed at 10 o'clock and slept soundly for the first time all week, the way a man sleeps when he's made a decision he can live with. Saturday morning. Rufus drove to the church at 8, before the dew burned off the gravel, before the heat of the day had reached its full intention. He parked under the pecan trees and sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off, listening to it tick. The parking lot was empty except for Hollis's Ford, parked squarely in front of the main steps the way it always was on Sunday mornings, as though Hollis arrived before anyone else as a matter of custom rather than particular intention. Rufus took the ledger from the seat beside him. He carried it in both hands, the oilcloth folded back so the book itself was bare. No wrapping now, nothing between the evidence and the man who needed to see it. He walked up the front steps and opened the door. The sanctuary was quiet and full of morning light. Sunlight came through the tall windows and lay in long, bright rectangles across the floor, across the new boards Rufus had laid with his own hands over the past week, the pine tight-grained and clean against the older wood around it. The ceiling fans turned slowly overhead. The smell of the room was hymnals and furniture polish, and something else underneath, older, the way very old buildings have a presence beneath the ordinary smells, the weight of all the years that have passed inside them. Hollis sat in the front pew. He had dressed for this in his Sunday suit, the dark jacket and pressed trousers he wore to service, the white shirt, the dark tie with the narrow stripe. His cane rested against the pew beside him. His hands were folded in his lap. He had the posture of a man at rest, but it was the kind of rest that has been arrived at through effort rather than ease. Rufus walked down the center aisle. His work boots were loud on the new wood, then quieter on the older boards, then loud again as he reached the new section near the front. The sound carried in the empty church the way sound does in a place that expects voices on Sunday and gets only 2 men on a Saturday morning. He stopped in front of Hollis. He placed the ledger on the pew beside him, cover facing up, and stepped back. He did not speak. Hollis looked at the ledger. His hands did not move from his lap. A full minute passed. Rufus counted it by the clock on the wall above the choir loft, the second hand moving in its careful arc, each tick distinct in the silence. Hollis's eyes stayed on the cover of the ledger. Then he reached out and opened it. He turned the pages slowly. His face was composed at first, almost deliberately so, the way a face is composed when the person behind it is deciding what expression to maintain. Rufus watched his hands moving through the pages, watched the slight tremor begin at the edge of one thumb, watched the muscles around his eyes tighten as the columns of numbers accumulated. Received, deposited, the difference, year after year. Hollis turned to the back pages. He found the deposit slips. He held one up briefly, then set it down. He found Elmer's note. He read it. He went very still, a breath caught in his chest, audible in the silence, a short, involuntary sound. He read the note again. Then he placed both hands flat on the cover of the ledger and closed his eyes. The clock ticked. Outside, a truck moved along the county road and passed, and the sound diminished. Hollis opened his eyes. He looked at the ledger under his hands. He did not look at Rufus. "How long have you known?" His voice was level, old. "A week," Rufus said. A long pause, then, "Elmer knew for 30 years. He said it in the same flat tone, not to Rufus exactly, more to the room, to the light on the floor, to the particular fact of Elmer Gadsden's patience, which had apparently reached Hollis in a way that the stolen money never had. His shoulders moved. Then they shook. The crying started as something almost silent, a tightening of his whole frame, the muscles working against it, and then it became audible, deep and uneven, the kind of sound that comes from somewhere below the chest from a man who has not wept in a very long time. His hands pressed flat on the ledger, and his head went down between his arms, and the sound of it filled the empty church. Rufus did not move. He did not speak. He did not reach for Hollis's shoulder or offer words. He had stood with grieving men before, at gravesites, at kitchen tables, and he knew that what they needed in the first minute was not comfort, but space to be exactly what they were. He stood and he waited. After a while, the sound diminished, and Hollis lifted his face. His eyes were red, the skin around them swollen, and he looked the age he was, 78 years old, the weight of the years he had lived showing in a way that the Sunday jacket had always managed to conceal before. He looked at Rufus directly. "I've been waiting," he said. His voice was rough. "Every year, when we pulled up the boards for anything, the furnace repair, the water pipe that froze in 2003, I was waiting for someone to find it." He stopped. "I put extra nails in that section when I thought Elmer might have hidden something. Tried to make it harder to reach." He looked at the ledger. "But I never moved it. I couldn't move it." He stopped again, not with hesitation, but with the completeness of a man who has run out of explanations and knows it. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Rufus looked at him for a moment. He looked at the light on the new floorboards. He looked at the framed photograph of the congregation in the hallway and thought about the faces in it. He thought about Pearl Gadsden in her rocker with her crooked glasses, telling him to finish what her husband started. He thought about Elmer Gadsden, who had sat in that kitchen chair in March of '91 and written down every penny. "Tell them," Rufus said. "Sunday, all of them." Hollis held the ledger on his lap. He sat with it the way you sit with something you've been carrying so long you've forgotten you were carrying it, and now it's been set down in front of you and you can see the shape of it. He nodded once. He did not argue. He did not bargain. He did not ask for time or conditions. He just sat in the empty church on a Saturday morning with 30 years of evidence on his lap and nodded, and the acceptance of it settled over him like the particular kind of tiredness that comes not from work but from a very long time of not resting. Rufus walked back down the center aisle. His boots were loud on the new wood, then quiet, then loud. He pushed the door open and went out into the August morning, where the pecan trees were dropping the first of their early nuts onto the gravel, and the air smelled of something beginning to change. Sunday morning came in on a light that was familiar and indifferent, the way Sunday mornings do in Alabama in August. the heat already working by 8, the sky the particular washed-out blue that means the afternoon will be fierce. Rufus dressed in his good shirt and dark slacks, boots polished the night before. He drove to church alone. Louise had stayed home with a summer cold that had settled in her chest overnight, and she'd told him to go without her in a tone that permitted no argument. He arrived early and sat in the back pew on the left side, against the wall. He watched the congregation come in. Families in pressed clothes, the children walking ahead of the adults and then looking back to make sure the adults were still following. Old Mr. Tatum, who was 81 and came every week on the arm of his daughter Celestine, who always arrived holding a paper fan from the funeral home, even when the morning wasn't hot enough to need one. Young Tommy Hewitt sat with his hat on his knee, turning it slowly in his hands, the way he did every Sunday, without appearing aware he was doing it. Pearl Gadsden came in at 5 minutes past the hour and took her usual seat, 3rd row, left side, the same spot she had occupied for 50 years. She settled herself, put her purse on the floor under the pew, and sat without looking around. She was wearing her good dress, the dark green one she wore for important occasions, and her hair was pinned precisely, and she had her hands folded in her lap and her eyes forward. She did not look toward the deacon's row. The choir filed in and warmed up in the loft with the first few measures of the opening hymn. The congregation found the page and rose. The singing was full. The building was at nearly its capacity this Sunday, the way it sometimes was in late summer before the September schedules started pulling people in other directions. The voices filled the space under the old ceiling and bounced off the new floorboards and rose toward the fans turning overhead. Rufus did not sing. He stood with the rest and held his hymnal and watched the front of the church. Hollis Mabry was in the deacon's row on the right side, 3 seats from the aisle. He had come in quietly before the service, taking his seat without his usual circuit of the building's perimeter, without his usual handshakes at the door. He was in his Sunday suit. His cane was upright against his knee. He sat with his eyes forward and his hands flat on his thighs, not folded. He did not turn to look at anyone. He did not exchange words with the deacon beside him. When the hymn ended and the congregation sat, Pastor Worthy stepped to the pulpit. He opened his Bible and found his place and then stopped. He closed the Bible. He set it down on the pulpit and stood with his hands at his sides for a moment, a gesture Rufus had never seen from him, the abandonment of the text. And then he stepped to the side of the pulpit and said, "Before we continue, Deacon Mabry has asked to address the congregation." The room shifted. Not loudly, a small collective rearrangement. The subtle change in a room of people when something unexpected has been announced and no one yet knows what it means. Hollis stood. He left his cane against the pew and walked to the front of the church without it. Slowly, because he was 78 and because the walk was not easy, but without leaning. He turned to face the congregation. He carried nothing in his hands. He stood in front of 300 faces he had known for the better part of half a century, and he began to speak. His voice was unsteady at first, not with age, but with the particular quality of a voice doing something it had been unable to do for a long time. He told them about the building fund. He told them about the 2 columns, what had been received each Sunday over 30 years, and what had been deposited. He paused and told them the difference. $183,000. He watched the number reach them the way a stone reaches water. He told them where the money went. A house he paid off in 2001, a car paid in full in 1998. His children's educations, which his children had always believed came from his own savings. He told them about Elmer Gadsden, who had found the truth in 91 and been silenced before he could act on it. He said Elmer's name clearly, not as an aside, but as a specific and important fact. He did not make excuses. He did not ask for forgiveness. He said, "I am telling you this because you deserved to hear it 30 years ago." He stopped. He said, "I am sorry." He said nothing else. The church was silent. Not the silence of a congregation waiting for the next verse. A different kind of silence. the kind that gathers in a room when something has shifted at the foundation, and no one has yet begun to move in the new configuration. A woman in the fourth row put her hand over her mouth. Her husband looked at the floor beside her feet rather than at the front of the church. In the far pew on the right, a man Rufus knew as Harold Norris, a farmer who drove in from the north end of the county every week and who had been at this church longer than almost anyone, stood up slowly and walked out through the side door without looking at Hollis, without looking at anyone. The door shut behind him with a sound that was deliberate and quiet and carried in the silence. Pearl Gadsden did not move. She sat in the third row, left side, with her hands in her lap and her eyes on Hollis, and her expression held 30 years of a quiet and specific knowledge being confirmed by the only voice that could confirm it. Rufus, watching from the back, could not see her face clearly. He didn't need to. Hollis finished. He stood for a moment at the front of the church, looking at the people he had served and robbed for 3 decades, and then he walked. Down the center aisle, the same aisle Rufus had pulled the boards from, the aisle that now had new wood running through its middle, he walked past every face, every pew, every family that had sat in this building every Sunday for years. No one stopped him. No one spoke to him. He reached the front door and pushed it open and walked out, and the screen door fell shut behind him with a small, precise sound that everyone in the room heard in the silence. Rufus sat in the back pew and watched him go. Pastor Worthy returned to the pulpit. His voice was thick but steady. He asked the congregation to bow their heads, and they did, and the prayer he offered was short and without flourish, a man asking for something he believed could still be given. After the service, people moved slowly, the way people do when they are not sure of the shape of the ground. Several of them stopped him before he reached the door. One of the older deacons shook his hand without speaking. A woman from the building committee touched his arm with an expression that mixed gratitude with something harder. 2 people walked past without acknowledging him at all. He walked to his truck alone. He got in and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. The church would survive. He knew that the way he knew which boards to replace, by the quality of the wood underneath, by how deep the rot had gone, by what was still solid. This congregation was old and stubborn. It had built this building once, it would hold. He drove home on the county road. Epilogue. Hollis Mabry was charged with embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty in October. At sentencing, the judge acknowledged his age, his voluntary confession, and his full cooperation. He received 5 years of probation and an order of full restitution. His house was sold. His savings account was seized. The total recovered reached $89,000, just under half of what had been taken. Hollis's children, who had learned the source of their educations during the public confession, repaid an additional $31,000 from their own accounts. They did not speak to their father again. 3 months later, the church board read a formal statement acknowledging Elmer Gadsden by name, what he had discovered, and what it had cost him. The board voted that morning to name the new fellowship hall the Elmer Gadsden Hall. The groundbreaking was the following spring. Pearl attended. She stood beside the wooden marker bearing her husband's name, while the pastor offered a short blessing, and a handful of congregation members turned the first shovels of earth. She did not speak. When it was over, she nodded once, a small, certain motion, and drove herself home in her old Buick. That evening, she wrote a note to Rufus on pale blue stationery. It arrived 2 days later. He read it once. He folded it along its original crease and put it in the breast pocket of his work shirt. The following Sunday, he stayed behind when the congregation filed out. He sat alone in the empty church on the back pew, his hands resting on his knees. The morning light fell in long rectangles across the floor, across the new boards he had cut and fitted himself, the grain clean and tight, the surface level and true. In his breast pocket was Pearl's note. He sat there a while in the quiet. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the door. He stepped out into the April morning, pulled the door shut behind him, and walked to his truck. Beneath the new boards there was nothing hidden now, only red clay and pine joists and the bones of an honest builder.